Are we live? Great. Today, you have made the best decision possible on how to spend your lunchtime. Welcome to all the wise people, and a very gigantic thank you to the World Bank's Director of Fragility, Conflict and Violence, Sukinya Kane, who has agreed to support us as we showcase our remarkable, exceptional grantees. As Margaret McNamara Education Grants epitomizes the example of supporting women, it is very natural that Lucia Henmar, lead economist of the bank's gender group, is also on board. Thank you for honoring us with your support. Margaret McNamara Education Grants' mission is to improve the lives of women and children by supporting the higher education of exceptional women from developing countries who will catalyze change. For more than 40 years, we have been supporting women from developing countries to uplift the lives of women and children. So far, 531 women and from 79 countries. Today, we will hear from 3 of these extraordinary women who not only survived their own circumstances, but are thriving today, along with the many women and children whose lives they have touched. We cannot do this without you. As a volunteer-led 501c3 charity, we we rely on your donations and contributions. Meg is registered with the World Bank's Community Connections Campaign, the CCC, and your donation at the end of the year makes a huge difference for us to be able to award grants to more exceptional women. Sukinya Kane, Director of Fragility, Conflict, Violence Group, or FCV for those in the know, has a well-traveled and very experienced CV. It is with confidence that we can say she knows the world in just about all regions. Sukinya joined the World Bank Group in 2003 and went on to increasingly important positions covering the Africa, MENA, and East and Central Asia regions. Before her appointment as FCV Director, she was Country Director for Mali, Burkina Faso, and Chad. In addition to leading the bank's FCV professionals, Sukinya also represents the World Bank Group in global forums and manages relationships related to the FCV agenda with the donor community and other stakeholders. Sukinya, Meg is very honored that you recognized and appreciated the work we do. Thank you for hosting our forum. I should add that Sukinya is not a all-work, no-play person. She's also a devoted NBA fan, am I right? And a workout in the gym enthusiast. It is with enormous gratitude that I present to you, Sukinya Kane, our moderator this afternoon. Thank you, Sukinya.
Thank you very much, Madeleine. I'm very happy to be here, and I agree with you. This is the best way to spend lunchtime rather than reading through emails. So I'm very happy to be here, and I realize that you know a lot about me. So, so let me really first by thanking you, and thanking the Margaret McNamara Foundation for this opportunity today, and. Having as well the opportunity to have these panelists and the theme about gender education and development in forced displacement is, as you can imagine, very relevant and dear to what the bank is doing. And before I turn to the panelists, I just want to take a couple of minutes to talk about this agenda, what it means for us, what the bank is trying to do. So in 2022. We unfortunately reached unprecedented record of more than 100 million of forcibly displaced people. And that's unprecedented. And this trend is as well a reflection of intensification of conflicts in many parts of the world since 1975, and the emergence as well of new theaters of conflict in the world. But it's also a reflection that we have not been quite successful in bending this trend of people forcibly displaced from and unrooted from their place. And of course, as we all may know, but it's good to emphasize, is that conflict and displacement, they pose a variety of challenges for people who are forcibly displaced, but as well for their host communities, as we know. And children living in countries affected by fragility and conflict are more than twice likely to be out of school compared to other children. And of course, when you look at the figures for girls, is 2.5 as much as for boys. So, and in some cases, like we've seen in Afghanistan recently, in Sahel, girls' education is specifically under attack. And so that's why an estimated of 222 million children and young people have had their education affected by conflict, violence, humanitarian crisis. This is an alarming threefold increase from 2016. And even when these children are able to escape conflicts, their access to education as refugees is dismally low. On average, 61% of refugee children access primary education, 23% only access secondary education, and a mere 1% access tertiary education. And of course, these figures are even lower if you look at, if you zoom on low-income countries. And what is the World Bank doing about this? The bank has really, in my view, taken a development approach as to the issue of forced displacement, recognizing that most of the refugee situation become protracted. So you have refugees, their kids being refugees, and probably their grandchildren as well being refugees. So that's why from the outset, having a medium-term development plan or perspective with a view of addressing the socio-economic needs and the aspiration of the refugees and their host communities. To date, the World Bank has spent $3 billion to projects in low-income countries, and which around 400 million on financing have been invested in education project, which is at the heart of your focus as well. And that's why I think really that today's conversation is timely, but as some of you may know, we have a World Development Report, which is our flagship report that the bank issues every year. It's on migrant, refugees, and societies. And I think it has really, I even believe that Washington Post today has made an article about that, saying how the World Bank was able to articulate a cool-headed report on such a hot topic. So I really encourage you to look at this report. So of course, in today's conversation, you will not have to hear from me too much and with all the figures, because World Bank, we like numbers, right? So we won't do that. So let me reassure. But we'll draw on experience and research of the panelists today, scholars from Gaza, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Colombia, and I realize that I have the pleasure of being in all those countries, which I'm very happy about. And they're engaged on three key topics related to the economic opportunities, inequality, and violence in forced displacement situation. They have also, our dear panelists, looked at how education can serve as a vector of peace. I always say that education is on both ends. It's going to be a driver of fragility when you don't have people don't have access to education, it can be as well a strong promoter of peace and source of resilience for societies. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to our dear panelists. So, Huri, Nohara, and Larissa, it's really for me a privilege to moderate this discussion with scholars like you. Your voice and work make an important contribution to this agenda and to the growing literature of gender dimension of forced displacement and the intersectionality of gender, education, and fragility. So I'm going to start with Huri. Please correct me if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. So let me start with just a couple of things about you, and I think I'm not giving justice to any of your background, but I know that you have done some exceptional work, Huri, having served as an advisor of the United States Refugee Advisory Board, founding the first refugee-led organization recognized by UNHCR, and you have conducted work as well focused on economic integration of refugees. So, based on your research and work, Huri, can you tell us about what needs to be done to ensure that forcibly displaced people become an asset for achieving development goals? Over to you, Huri.
Sure. Thank you very much for the introduction. When we're talking about the forced displacement or forced displaced population, the first thing comes to my mind when we want to talk about forced displaced people is to start to accept the reality that migration is not going to stop, right? And forced migration is not going to go away. So we have to change the mentality of stopping migration, controlling migration, and we start talking more about how we can navigate migration, managing migration in a way that benefits all sides, right? The host communities and the refugee themselves. So the first thing to do is to start thinking about how we can we accept and admit that migration is not going away. This is the first one. The second one also relates to the perception, because of the perception that we always want to control migration, we want to stop migration, we're always receiving forcibly displaced people as burdens. The first thing that comes to our minds when we're talking about refugees is, okay, now we need help, we need humanitarian support, we need relief, we need all these resources that will go for refugees, not for host communities, and this is where we see the clash comes from some governments or even host population on why we have to do that, or why it is them, not us. And the approach toward refugees have been for too long for now as seeing as a burden. So now we have to start thinking in another way and looking on how this population of people really have skills, right? They come with the skills and potentials that could be benefiting the host country, and even when they are ready to go back to their countries, they go back with their skills uplifted, not even neglected for years. So the first thing is to change the mentality. The second thing is to start with changing the perception that to receive them as a burden is not the right way, and to start thinking to include them in the development plan of the countries. And I know, like, when we talk about development plan, countries will be like, yeah, we have enough on our plates. So we're talking also about including refugees, but what we argue is that think about the cost of not including them, right, in the long run. So this population is not going away. It's not going to stop. Yes, it is supposed to be a temporary situation, but we're seeing. I come from a refugee background, was born and raised as a refugee, as a Palestinian refugee. And we have been refugees for 76 years. So this is the biggest evidence that it is not going away. And if we have to learn something from the country where I was born and raised, Lebanon, is that you need to include refugees in the development plan. Otherwise, you will not getting anything right out of it, right? As Palestinian refugee in Lebanon, yes, we were not included in the development plan. Access to job was really very limited. Access to education is also limited. So what we're getting out of it is exploitation for women. We have also a lot of extremism and violence. So the country didn't win, by not including the refugees in the plan, and the refugees themselves didn't win, and we were not able to create a win-win situation for everyone. So including them in the development plan within the country, looking at, do they have access to job? Can they go to school? We have to make sure that we don't have lost generations. We have millions of lost generations of kids outside of schools, right? So what we expect in the long run, yes, the bill is now high, but in the future it's going to be higher if we don't really include them in the plan. The third thing that I think about is the shared responsibility, right? We always hear about the shared responsibilities among governments, among international organization, but in reality, it doesn't mean shared responsibility. We're having it written as a shared responsibility, but in reality, we're seeing it as, okay, as long as they are not here, we can help you to keep them out, right? So we see some governments are just really trying to keep them out and doing their best that they don't come to the country, and this is how they think about shared responsibility, just helping a country to keep their refugees there, which also didn't prove as the best way to deal with the refugee population. I think there should be a meaningful shared responsibility among governments, because yes, some wars are far, right? Some war is not impacting our country physically, but also we all know that if we have to go and dig deep to the causes of the war, we can see also there is a shared responsibility among all governments. So if the causes of the war is shared, then also the burdens of what is happening after the war should be shared among governments too. And not only governments, I see also there should be a multi-intersectionality between sectors. Here we're talking about governments, we are talking about private sector, international organization, nonprofit sector. If sectors didn't work together, we're not going to get anywhere. If each sector is going to have their own plan and planning on their own bubble, this is not going to be solved. When we're talking about including refugees in the development plan, we need governments to be talking with the private sector, to be talking with international organization, with non-government organizations, to make sure no one is left behind. And here is just a small note also about the international organizations have been doing a lot, and we cannot deny this reality, but also there is a lot of harm have been done over years. When we talked about the perceptions toward refugees, we also talking about how refugees have been posed to the general public in terms of victims. They need help, we need donations, we need. So the first thing when it comes to our mind, when we hear the word refugee, is like someone who doesn't have money, doesn't have food, or barefooted, just sitting, needing help, right? This is most of the pictures that have been seeing for refugees over the last 7 years or so. We're not saying this does not exist. It does exist, but also there is a responsibility on the international organization to start also shifting this narrative, right? Yes, there is something like that, but also they have skills, they have potential, they can do something. It is not just victims needing for help. So we need the support of the international organization on this matter to try and change the perception. And lastly, sorry if I took long, I think there is no development plan would work without having it driven from and with refugees themselves. So we cannot expect to have a development plan here in DC or New York thinking that we get it right, or because we did our research or we have an X degree, then we know best about the country. This is not gonna go anywhere, and it's the evidence, because after all these years, we're still talking about how we can deal with the situation. So when we're talking about a development plan, if it is not driven by refugees themselves, from their needs, by including refugee leaders on the table and getting their opinion on how things should be done, the plan will not be effective. And I think like it have been proven this is the situation, and I see that a lot of organizations started to really think about how to include the refugee leadership in having them on the table when it comes to talking about development plan for refugees. And this is where also we see that the World Bank have been doing a lot recently. When it comes to the reports, the WDR, we see the tone, we see the the narrative that the World Bank have put in this report, and it's different than what have been done before. So we really acknowledge this part. And also, we acknowledge that the World Bank have also recently been working with some refugee-led organizations and trying to engage more refugee leadership in the work. So if we don't include refugees, if we don't have them on the table as the refugee leaders, we're not getting anywhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie. That was really inspiring. So I'm hearing refugees are here to stay. They're not going away. So we have to face this reality. We should not treat them only as a burden. They have skills, they have potential. And I'm glad that you refer to the WDR, because this is more or less what the WDR is saying, and even having a framework of match and motive, right? What is depending on what is the motive and what is the match between the refugee and the host country, and I very much as well hear you when you said cost of inaction. Yes, there's a cost of including refugees, but we do not necessarily talk about the cost of inaction, and lastly, the shift in mentality and behavior. And we hope that not only the WDR but organizations like MMEG do contribute to changing this behavior and narrative. Now I'm going to turn to Larissa. Let me say a few words of introduction to which, as well as I said, that will not give justice to all the things that you do, but just to say that your work focuses on peace, education, and you have conducted research on intersection of intercultural, critical, and peace pedagogies in teacher education and language, and cultural didactics at Cornell University as a visiting fellow. So Mike, the question now is the following. Your work is very interesting in that it places education at the center of the response of addressing violence. Could you please tell us more about the implication of your work for addressing the divisive narratives, that often fuel and sustain grievance in areas that are endemically affected by conflict and violence? Over to you, Larissa.
Thank you so much. Before I start, I'd like to express my gratitude just for being here. This is a very special day for me, and I feel very grateful to Margaret McNamara and also to all of you who are hosting this event. I'd like to start in connection to discussing the role of education in this important context. Just a little bit, I'm not going to tell my story, the whole story, but just something that deeply defined my conviction and my commitment to peace and nonviolence, because this is so much interwoven with the role of education and the question that you raised. So I was 18 years old when the war started in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I personally experienced the consequences of the most brutal and devastating effects of the war. So it was not something we learned from the books, from the history textbooks. This was not something we visited and sort of analyzed in museums, but this was really something we lived through for 4 years. So during the war in Bosnia, I could not go to school for 4 years. I could not go to the university. So I had this gap in education. Speaking of the access to education, this was not enabled to me and to a lot of my friends and colleagues coming fresh from high school at a time in the former Yugoslavia, in the country of Bosnia and Herzegovina at the moment of, breaking up and the war really hitting hard different communities and different spheres of life. So I personally experienced what this gap and not having access to education really meant. And I got personally involved at a community level as a peace activist and as someone who actually redefined my purpose and meaning in the community by taking very active engagement in the work with children, families, and those who have been internally displaced from the eastern part of Bosnia and Herzegovina and who were coming to look for the refuge in the city, my hometown of Zenica, where I worked with refugees in these refugee camps, but also in terms of providing psychosocial support for war-traumatized children. And the reason why I'm mentioning this part of my personal history is really to sort of define and really emphasize this deep conviction that I have around the role of education and how it plays a critical, I would say, value in shaping the minds and the hearts of the communities and the people who are part and members of the educational community. So in connection to your question, I would like to revisit this sort of framing of what it means to be endemically affected by conflict and violence in these countries that are affected by conflict, when we also need to look at more broadly, the very notion of conflict and violence that I think is actually endemically affecting our own human community. So if we look at the history of human development, this is what we are seeing. We are seeing violence and conflict raging in the histories of each of our communities and in each of our countries. So it's not just the countries that are at the present moment deeply affected by the war, or like Bosnia and Herzegovina, still suffering from the effects of the war. It's really something that we should always bear in mind if we think of the history of human development. So this is something that is endemically defining who we are as human beings. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of these examples. Coming here to DC, I've been to the museums of African American history. I've been to the Museum of the Holocaust. We are seeing these instances throughout the history of human development. So this is one thing that I'd like to reframe. Also, I'd like us to remember that since the 1945, which is the turning sort of point in the history of the European, in the context of the European history of war, we have the evidence that the interstate wars have declined dramatically since 1948, and intrastate conflict and new forms of war have actually increased since the 1960s. And what we have also seen, if we look like historically and more broadly, we are seeing that the tyranny has in many places been replaced by different forms of democracy, which is really the advancement of the human, of the human nature. But we also, on the other hand, know that these communities, if we can name a lot of them at the moment, we're also seeing the instances of corruption, conflict, state suppression and oppression, violence, even gun violence, including this particular country, that really undermine trust in governments, which are actually inviting us to look how democracy is very fragile and how we are actually seeing the global erosion of democratic values as we speak. So, to go back to the role of education that I'm very big advocate for, and I told you about the piece of the history in my own personal experience of why I really advocate for the role of education, because I really strongly defend and believe in the transformative power of education. I think that we have to revisit the notion that education is at a very important crossroad of our human history. We have to make some important decisions within our governments, within our educational policies, within our educational institutions, to rethink where we are in connection to our humanity that I think is really struggling. I think we are at the crossroad where humanity is really deeply suffering and deeply struggling. So, on one hand, what we are seeing as a human sort of advancement is lots of innovation, prosperity, technological achievement. Coming to Cornell University, I can just name lots of these advancements in terms of technological advancement in higher education, emancipation in different communities and different countries, improved health, healthcare, support, even though this is also very problematic in a lot of other communities that are called developed countries, diverse societies that have been enriched by migration and refugees, and also the issues of human rights. So we are seeing a lot of advancement on one hand, but on the other hand, what we are seeing that these benefits have not equally benefited everyone in the human race, in the global community of different cultures and different countries. And I think this is very problematic. So what we are seeing is that different ideologies, different political and economic systems are actually monopolizing social, political, and economic benefits in favor of such a very small number of those who are privileged, at the expense of those who have been marginalized, excluded for centuries, for years. So my conclusion in connection to that, is that if we think of exclusion, we have to know that exclusion is also a form of violence. So it's a structural, cultural violence. It's not just something that is a physical violence. That is just, the effect of something that is deeply rooted as something that is unjust and something that is ingrained in the culture and in, the social spheres of different communities. So we are seeing resurgence of trade wars, gun violence, nationalist rhetoric, xenophobia, radical sort of movements, radicalization, social isolation. We've seen a lot of that in the pandemic, alienation, loneliness. As we speak, I'm sure everyone can identify some of these issues in different communities. So what we need to rethink are those modes of governance that are based on that powerful is right, that might is right, that using force and military to oppress opposition and to monopolize power, these are the root causes of grievances. Not violence. Violence is just manifestational. So we need to think in terms of what these cultures are reproducing. Cultures of competition, cultures of, the wars for power. So this is at the root cause of what creates these grievances. So I really wanted to address that. So again, in my conclusion to this question, I really want to emphasize, and you also mentioned that in the beginning, education can have these two roles. So it can be the driver of fragility, to use your words. So it can be seen in sort of two different tracks. It can generate conflict, it can add to conflict, it can be used as a political weapon. And we are seeing that even in the countries that are not under the war. We are seeing how education can be politicized. We are seeing how education can be used as, weaponized tools to implement certain agendas. We've seen that in our country. So we are reading the elements of that also in other communities. We can see that that education can also be an accomplice to social injustices, if not treated more seriously. It can also be an accomplice to wars and conflicts. So, on the other hand, luckily, we are lucky also to know that education could also be that key to promote diversity, social justice, interdependence, dialogue, cooperation, critical and creative collaborative approaches to complex problem-solving issues, which we need in the world we live today. It also requires deep personal reflections. It requires ethics. I think we have lost ethics in education, so ethical decision-making. And also, we need to infuse in education these elements of moral courage to prepare our young children and young people to, to speak out and to speak up against the instances of social injustice. So, the historical roots, and I'm also taking from Korea, historical roots of these inequalities and these social privilege positions need to be readdressed, which is why we now also have pedagogies of reconciliation and healing, but also decolonizing pedagogies that need to be infused and framed critically in the approaches to education. We need to teach our students how to live together in the very unjust world. And to quote Martin Luther King, one of my sources of motivation and inspiration, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So I'd like to conclude with that, to invite everyone to think more critically always about the role of education in all communities in our interdependent world. So thank you so much for the question.
Thank you very much, Larissa, for bringing this historical perspective for sharing your own history. I think it's really touching. Behind the numbers, we talk about the number of forcibly displaced people, but when you hear whether it's Rui or yourself talking about your own, it brings back home what it means to be a refugee and how you can use that to change for the better. So, and we hear you on those drivers of fragility as well: inequalities, governance, political settlements, injustice. All these, in a way, when we do a diagnostic that we call risk and resilience assessment, we try to understand what are the key drivers of fragility in the country. And what you just said come often as a common thread of a driver and impact of fragility. So really thank you for bringing that perspective. So now I'm going to shift gears to focus on issues of rights in forced displacement context. So Nohora, glad you're here. So your research, you have done some research, from my understanding, on Venezuelan child and youth migration on the Colombian-Venezuelan border. And you looked into questions of rehabilitation for children and young people, while addressing larger questions related to peace building. So that doesn't give justice, once again, to all the work that you've been doing, but just put it there as a matter of introduction. So one of the key area of reflection within the bank is now how to support prevention around the world. What can you tell us? And it's not an easy topic, right? Because we said the Pathway for Peace report taught us that we have to pivot to prevention, but yet what does it mean? From the bank, we're doing a lot already, but it's not an easy question. So what can you tell us about what successful strategies could be adopted to really forestall the production and reproduction of violence in fragile contexts? Over to you.
First, I'm sorry. It's my first time speak English, and I will. You will be patient with me, please. I think that the first point for the prevention is the perspective with you. Study and look the not the violence, the different violence, and how different violence connect and reproduction together. No, is very important, because in the academia and the academy and the government, the pay attention is at the fragmented violence. No. And I think that is very important. The chronic violence, the context, in this case, Mexico and Colombia, the context, the armed violence, and understand very well this linked together. The violence with against the children, against the children, and the violence against the women, and the violence criminal is connected. For example, I say this in example. I know two sisters in Nogales. Is a city, the border with the Arizona, and I work in this city. And I know two sisters. One girl, the 7 years, and your sister, the 4 years old. And the situation that these children is the custody with grandmother, because your mother have problem with the crystal meth. And for me is very this situation very impact me with the children all time. Oraban, rezaban. pray to God, but the God resolve the problem, no? Because the government don't have the policy with the prevention, addiction prevention. And for me, it's very impactful, no? Because it's a really problem in Mexico, in Colombia, in Latin America, and this country, and the police don't exist, no? And the problem is for these girls, pray, no? But your mothers solved what this situation, and your father is the cooker, the crystal method for the narcos in this city. And I think that this example represents that the linked the all violence, because the government retrieve the children and your mother and your father and custody and grandmother, but don't think about this situation, the addicts, the problems with the drugs, the problems with the violence criminal are in the experience, no, specific in this life, the children. I think that is very important. Then look the problem, the violence in this perspective, no, the different linkages, the different violence in this city, but I think that this the whole country in Mexico, particularly is the disappearance the women, no, and the girls, and this border is very problematic, and because the girls all time say me, I feel that the white band cross it and take me, no? I think that the government don't look this situation, and it's necessary. In this case, the education, no formal education, for the children have space to talk about this fear, this trauma, and find together ways the protection, no, with them, and they grow up in the other mind about the violence, the no ways in this way, the criminal violence. I think that is very important, no? Because the other example, I work with young people that work in the criminal groups, the sicarios, and all time say me, I need that they need that the adults, no, the people listen us, no, the people no listen, no, the people think that they young is bad, they are bad, are evil, and don't matter, no. I think that this in this way we need building new narrative, no, contra-narrative with this narrative, the criminal violence and this. I think that is very necessary, and I think that the arts, the no formal education is very important for the construction. I'm sorry. This narrative of the deed, no, of the deed all time in the society, I think that is very, very important for our government, our society, and the academy too. Thank you.
Thank you. No, you did very well. I think this was very clear, and thank you for bringing this example and the trauma that it brings to children, to their family, and the blurred line between gang violence, criminal organization, migration. So really thank you for that. Now we have time, I think, for a second round of questions. Even though I'm getting the look that I should be quicker. Yes, but this is so fascinating as a discussion, so we'll try to do it quicker though. So Larissa, I think related to work on child war trauma, peace, education, what we see is that even when schooling is available, and unfortunately we know that it's not always the case, but even in that case, we see that kids continue to have this psychological trauma, which can affect their academic performance, and down the line we can see those inequalities and marginalization being perpetuated one way or the other. So at the level of schools and education system in conflict affected setting, what can we do to break what could be considered as a vicious cycle, right? You're immigrant, you're refugee, you don't get access, you don't have your place in the society, and so on. This is really like being trapped in this vicious circle. Do we have any strategies that have been tested that you have seen in some context? Thank you. And Alima is giving us the look to be quick.
Okay, I'll try to summarize it quickly. So I think this connects to what Nora mentioned about the role of trauma. Mm-hmm. So I think this is the sort of expansion of thinking really critically of how war experience psychologically affects the development of young children and their families. So I'll just remind everyone that trauma is not what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you as a result of what had happened to you. So I worked for 7 years before coming here to do my master's study 20 years ago. I worked for 7 years in a local NGO on the issues of war trauma. So I worked with children who were internally displaced. So these were refugees from eastern part of Bosnia who were, forced to leave their homes. So this was a different sort of resettlement, but it was equally challenging to sort of help these children and support these children to process their war traumas. So I have the foundation of my peace work is really in the work on war child trauma and the issues of supporting these families to overcome these consequences. So I can just briefly speak, this is a huge field that I'm not an expert of, but as I said, I worked in the beginning years of my work in the community as a peace activist and nonviolence activist. I worked in these issues directly in the communities. And that has sort of shaped also the way I see the role of peace building, so it's sort of interconnected. So I'll speak from that perspective on the importance of education again. I'll just try to re-emphasize that and try to address what you mentioned. So what we learned from this experience is that trauma can be sort of played out at two different levels. So usually in literature, what we get to see is the individual experience of trauma. So people who have been forcibly displaced, people who come here also as immigrants, as migrant families. This is something that we have seen, and this is usually played out at the level of post-traumatic stress syndrome. So it's an individual trauma. While the larger community, or for those people who come from the war-affected communities, I think this is what they carry with them. The larger framework, and this is speaking for the Bosnian context, the country that is still suffering from the consequences of the war, this is the social trauma. So this is a larger framework that is rarely dealt with strategically, because this is a collective trauma of the whole society, that the whole society goes through. So what is really important to understand is that it is not this immediate pain, but really these long-term deviations and these long-term distortions that induce in the way that children or families will continue to perceive the world, even though it's a new world for them physically, it's still the world that they are carrying in the baggage that will shape the way they experience the reality in which they live in. So this has been the lesson that I've learned having worked with children and families. So how is that played out for understanding, the histories, the conditions of living, the role of education? If not healed, we can write the stories of our future that are based on the untreated pain of our past histories, if we do not treat them constructively with empathy and with healing. So this is very important to understand at that level. And I think what is the role of education there is, I'll try to get to my point. What is really important that I want to make as a point is that we have to have these trauma-informed approaches to peace building and education. And we should always see the larger framework without having this deep understanding of the underlying specific context of the trauma that are socio-political, socio-psychological. We can get in a trap or a danger to pathologize individual traumas of people, of children and their families, because we disregard also the potential of human beings to be resilient. This is what we also learned by working with children, because in a lot of these situations, children were naturally resilient to the ways they cope with the situation. So let me just get to the concluding remark. I'm getting some warning for the time. I'm sorry. So in terms of what can be done, what is a good practice, I can mention one really wonderful project that I did at the level of the university, and this is in connection to emphasizing the role of non-formal education that I was involved in for many years. But then since I assumed the position at the university, I have become a big advocate of formal education and infusing the values of peace education and peace pedagogy into the formal educational practices and frameworks. So institutionalizing trauma-informed peace-building approaches to education and institutionalizing peace education and the work with teachers to prepare teachers how to know to work with sensitive and contested issues, narratives that have been marginalized, narratives that are continuously silenced. So I'm really advocating, to add to what you have mentioned, I'm advocating for these formal education approaches in terms of institutionalizing and learning from the communities like, for example, the Bosnian community. We have a lot of good examples of how we navigated through the system despite the divisiveness, despite the conflict, despite the dominant narratives. So I think it's important to have a dialogue around and have this exchange of good practices despite all these hardships. So I will stop here, knowing that other people also, that my colleagues also have something to say, of course. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Larissa. Fascinating. And I think really I like how you frame the personal trauma, which is, of course, a lot of suffering, but as well how it can impact the social fabric and how it can impact the society as a whole. And this is something important to notice. And I think that allows me to go back to Nohara, and and as well I think in this area of trauma that you have as well articulated very well, you work at the intersection of different actors, right? Civil society, I think academia, and policymakers. What are the lessons that you can share with us on how you were able to navigate with those different stakeholders in your engagement? Thank you.
The example in the project with the University de Glasgow and Fundación Ideas para la Paz in Colombia, I work the peace building and education, no formal education in Acapulco and Medellin. No? And the foundation, I think that learned about the all work the communities. So the important initiative from the arts for building counter narratives to the dynamics the dead, no, in Medellin. But in Acapulco, the academia, the academy, the research, work in the action research, no? And in this way, the meeting with the artists, victims, other people, other society, civil society. I think that we was the bridge for the civil society meeting, no, and recognize about your work. And I think that is very important, no, that the academy is very desk, no, very computer, no work in the no field work, and the potential and help the civil society meeting and recognize and work together. I think that is very important, our role in this way. And I think that the society, I think that the civil society learn or need learn about the different ways, different perspectives to work, and the very opposite, but in fragile context is more important. Understand the minimum links, but work together, no? Besides this opposite perspective, I think that is very important, and I think that this I'm sorry, the findings in this case, in this research in Medellin and Acapulco.
Great. So thank you very much, Nuhura. I don't have time to summarize, just so I'm going to turn to Horaidi. So you mentioned the WDR report, and I think one perspective is really the lingering effects of COVID-19, global economic crisis, with as well the consequence of the war in Ukraine. We don't see this trend going down, right? So as a scholar and practitioner, have worked in FCV countries in different parts of the world. What can countries who are affected by fragility, conflict, and violence, what can they do really to leverage these trends that you have mentioned?
Cool, thank you. I will be short because I know we're tight on time. I think, as you were talking before, Larissa and Nora, that when we have to go to the root causes of the fragility and conflict, it will go to different forms of inequalities, right? We're talking about social inequalities, economic inequalities. We have seen that the different type of insecurities, if it is physical, economic, social, is leading people to pick up guns, right? And this is what is leading to conflict. So if we're talking about the fragile and conflict countries, the first thing they have to do is to manage or to try to address the inequalities, the different form of inequalities that they have in their states. And we have to go also how they can manage the different form of inequalities. We can talk till tomorrow, but I can just mention four main things to focus on, or tools. The first one, to make sure that they have really stable institutions, right? Institutions that are capable of providing equal resources and making sure that all the population is benefiting equally or fairly, we can say, if not equally. We have to make sure that we have also robust policies in place, policies that make sure that they have the right investments in the human resources that they have. They have the right investments in terms of technology, and the list goes on. But to make sure that their population is ready in terms of education, they have the healthcare, they have the economic opportunities, they have all what they need to be able to really compete and be. And I'm conflicted to use the word resilient, but yeah, to be resilient in a situation of conflicts and fragility. And third is the corruption, right? It all goes back to the corruption. If they're gonna always give the blind eye of what is going on in the governments or what is going on outside of the governments in the country, we won't get anywhere. So we also they need to focus on the issue of corruption. And lastly, and the most important, we have to see, are they really investing in their children and women? And this is why we're here today, right? Because it all goes back to the investment and the development programs and strategies and plans on how they are investing in their children and women. We have like a quote in Arabic. It means in a way that if you take care of the woman as if you have taken care of the whole population, right? So we have to go back to the root of taking care of the women and the kids, because we see that women during conflicts are one of the most vulnerable population that pays for the cost of the war. But when the war ends, they are the least to be taken care of in most cases. So we have, and this is why we're here today, to talk about the importance in investing in the women and children, kids and skills. And we know that sometimes investing, as Meg is doing, we are not just investing in one person, and this is what we're saying always. You are not investing in one individual, a woman. We are investing in a cause. We are investing in breaking a cycle of poverty, because if we make sure one person get the chance to get an education, to go to school, they will be able sometimes to break the cycle of poverty in their family and the generations that comes after. And yeah, so this is so important to focus on institutions, policies, and investing in women and kids. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I think our panelists deserve a round of applause. I did a poor job of managing time, but I still want to take a few questions from participants in this room or in joining online. Maybe take a couple of questions. If you have more questions, we'll be back. We'll be able to respond later. But I just want to hear as well if you could have if you have a few burning questions from. Okay, we know we're between you and your lunch, but yes, there's a. Yes, and lunch it would be absolutely. Thank you for telling me my lunch. Yeah, you can ask your question over lunch. So if you could please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Sure. Hi, I'm Megumi. Thank you so much for this panel. It was extremely informative. One question I had was when discussing trauma-informed institutionalization within formal education, I wanted to see if you had an example of that, just because what was going through my head was would it be the teachers themselves who would then have to be more trauma-informed, and would it be more embedded into all curriculums, or would it be its own separate sort of class, and which one of those would you think is more effective?
Thank you. If you are, I'm going to take another question and then give you an opportunity to respond. I also want to make sure if online, yeah, yes, another question in this room. So, yes, please. You can use your mic in front of you, no?
Oh.
Sorry.
Hi, my name is Grace Mkupa. I'm one of the board members for the MMEG, so thank you for having us here. Quick question. Working with trauma is traumatic. What makes you smile and continue to do that work? What is something that you like, that you enjoy so much, that is non-trauma outside your work? Thank you.
And I'm going to take the last question. Okay.
Okay, hello. My name is Mariela. I was a grantee for Margaret McNamara, so I'm very happy to be here, and I'm happy for all the presenters. You were great. I'm from Mexico, so we are living right now a crisis of refugees, And you were talking about change the narrative of refugees. So I'm trying to imagine how we can do that through education.
So we try to answer very quickly. Who would like to take the first question on trauma? Arisa, you want to take that?
On trauma and also trauma-informed peace building, and whether the teachers would be adequately prepared and how to do that and how to institutionalize that. Just a quick sort of response to that. That has been my work for many years. We just recently published a book, a compilation of good practices, where this has been an attempt to institutionalize this approach. We are not saying that this is taking place in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We are far from institutionalizing it due to a very complicated political structure that is deeply dividing the society. But we are trying to find these little inroads within the educational system where such approaches would be possible. So whether this would be a separate subject or something that is sort of embedded in different curriculum courses and areas, we are really strongly advocating for infusing this as sort of lenses of looking at different subjects within the curriculum, where this will become a philosophy of education. So an approach to living, an approach to really learning about any particular subject. So we are really advocating for peace building being infused across different subjects within the curriculum. And in order to have teachers adequately prepared for that, this is really a very big challenge, because a lot of these approaches would acquire and require teachers to carefully tailor their methodologies, their pedagogies, their approaches to dealing with something that is very emotionally explosive, if you want. And this is what teachers shy away from because they're not adequately prepared for that. And in terms of trauma-informed approaches, we know that we have to enable also these authentic vulnerabilities to actually take place within the classroom settings. And everyone within the educational policies, practitioners, teachers, are really afraid to get into death. And I think we need to think through more carefully, and there's some brilliant work also to teach about the affective domains of learning and teaching, and preparing teachers to adequately know how to use specific strategies that are efficient to address contested and controversial and very painful narratives and content. So I'll stop here.
Thank you. And as I said, we can over lunch continue the conversation. So just quickly on what brings you joy in doing this and how you keep your spirit high and how to change the narrative. Nahura, you want to take? Or Huri first, Nahura. And then you have 1 minute for closing remarks. So,
just the question is how to change the narrative by education.
Narrative about refugees.
Okay, I will be so summarized here. But I think when we are talking about changing the narrative out there, we start by seeing what is out there, what is the narrative that have been there for 50 years, and how can we counter it. And I think there is a lot of evidence-based research that have been done so far that shows the contribution, if we're talking facts, evidences, that shows the importance or the contributions of refugees and migrants in the host communities. We're showing a lot of research that's showing, actually in the US, within 15 years, 80% of the labor increase in the US would be foreign-born, right? So the US American-born people will not be able to cover the need for the labor in 15 years, right? We're talking about 80% will be foreign-born. So we're talking about evidences and research that's showing the contribution of refugees and migrants to the host communities when it comes to the economic part. We're also talking about research that's showing the enrichments and diversity that are bringing to the host communities or to the host countries. And there is a lot of research out there. Also now we're talking about the importance of migration, the need for labor in some countries, the decrease in the population in other countries. All of that is leading us to the fact that we need migrants, we need migration, but the question is how we're going to deal with them and how we're going to make the best use of having the migrants and refugees in our country.
I think you responded to to both questions. Hora, anything you would like to add, or we can go to the no?
In the first question, I think that it's very important that the universities teaching the young people, no, and the students in the countries and fragile context about this situation in particular. Example, in Colombia, the universities learning about the universities live in fragile context, in armed violence, and the professionals must be pay attention about this context and the life, the people about in this situation. In this moment, in the north, in Mexico, in the border, we have problems. They find the psychologists and sociologists and anthropologists that understand very well this context, the violence, the criminal violence, and the impacts for the life in the children, and about the displacement, the forced displacement, and the forced migration, and the refugees. It's very hard find this professional, and this is the problem for the universities, that no understand very well your context.
Thank you. And now, any closing remark you want to leave this audience with before I hand over to Lucia, who has been very patient with me? So, any closing remark? If you don't have any, it's okay. But yeah, we can move on. Okay, thank you. So,
wow.
Over to you, Badman.
Yes. Wow. Wow, Meg, you truly have extraordinary grantees. Thank you, ladies, for sharing your knowledge and your passion with us today, and for the important work you do every single day to make this world a better place for women and children. Lucia Hamner is the ideal person to have the last word. She is a lead economist in gender and development at the World Bank, where she leads work on fragility, conflict, and violence. As the person at the helm of the bank's Gender Dimensions of Forced Displacement Research project, Lucia is perfectly positioned to close today's discussion before we enjoy our meal together and meet one another. Thank you, Lucia, for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Madeleine, and thank you to the McNamara Foundation. First of all, it's been an absolute privilege and honor to be part of this conversation, and I've learned so much from your contributions, and I applaud your efforts to continue this work and continue the academic research and evidence, which is so important if we're going to make any progress on this extremely important agenda. So, as Madeleine said, I was working on a recently completed research project for the World Bank on gender dimensions of forced displacement. Sorry, is that better? Okay, so I was working on a recently completed research project on the gender dimensions of forced displacement. And the need for this research was very much driven by, we know that in every crisis is different, but there are commonalities. And for the families that have to leave their homes for whatever reason, for war or for climate, internally or over borders, their families are often separated, they lose assets, their livelihoods are lost, they encounter language barriers, they encounter discrimination, and these experiences are different for men or women. So, to understand the nature of these impacts and the barriers and opportunities, because sometimes there are opportunities at the destination for women and to pursue education or to work in ways that they might not have been able to in their countries of origin, but to really understand the different impacts between men and women. We need more evidence, and then we can build the policies that will really respond and be the most effective to build pathways out of fragility and risk. So we looked at research in 17 countries. I was going to tell you a lot about what the findings were, but because I'm between you and lunch, I'm going to skip over a little bit. But what I wanted to pick up on, because this has been a prevalent theme of all your contributions, was one of our research teams was looking at gender-based violence. This is a huge issue globally, and it becomes elevated in settings of conflict and fragility. We found that women who were forcibly displaced were more likely to experience intimate partner violence. Quite often the emphasis is on violence by the hands of strangers, by the hands of armed militias and armed forces, but the violence is also elevated in the family, which relates very much to what Larissa was saying, and also to Nahora's points about the siloing of how we look at violence. And in fact, women who in Colombia were more, and Liberia, we had data for these two countries, were over 40 or 50% more likely to experience past year intimate partner violence than their host communities. So, and we know also that the impacts of gender-based violence are lifelong, and experiencing violence puts the individual more at risk of experiencing violence in future, as does witnessing violence, as does living in a household where there is drug or alcohol abuse by the male partner usually, and also where you're living in an environment where there is tolerance of violence against women, where it's accepted as a social norm. So this kind of entry point, and not seeing violence as a siloed issue, as being different from the other violence in society, I think is hugely important to make progress on this agenda. So I just wanted to bring up that particular element of our research because it really resonated with a lot of things that you spoke about. So then to think about how can the World Bank best respond to forced displacement and to lift the gender-specific constraints experienced by women and girls, but also by men and boys. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about the new gender strategy we're working on at the bank, because there's an opportunity here to carry on this conversation, I think. So this is going to guide the World Bank Group's programming and investments on gender equality in the period through to 2030. We're working on it at the moment. It's work in progress, so we're engaging and listening. So where we've got to, the strategy starts from the premise that gender equality is for all, regardless of gender identity or sexual orientation. And this is consistent with the World Bank's principles of non-discrimination. So that's where we are. The strategy has the ambition, it's called Accelerate Gender Equality for a Sustainable, Resilient and Inclusive Future. And the goal is that the World Bank will support innovation, financing and collective action towards achieving 3 strategic objectives that underpin this goal. So 3 strategic objectives are to elevate human capital and to end GBV. We might have to change that to prevent GBV because maybe this is ambitious. To expand and enable economic opportunities for women. And by enable, we mean to put in place things like care services so that women can actually have care service, can go to work, and to enable them access to digital technologies. So not just opening up jobs, but actually making it practical for people to take up those jobs. And then the third component, which I think is really important, is to engage women as leaders, as part to achieve these objectives. So our strategy is based on our recent experience of the World Bank. We had a previous gender strategy. We had a World Development Report on gender equality in 2012. We now have 10 years of really kind of concentrated efforts. And we've invested a lot in data and research, and we've increased our project work, and we have increased the responsiveness of our projects to gender by introducing a gender flag, which shows whether the operations are aiming to close a gender gap, whether they've identified an area of gender discrimination, whether that's in education, health, livelihoods, and they're trying to do something about it. So the insights really, one of the key insights was that women's leadership and gender equality can drive sustainable, resilient and inclusive development, and also that achieving gender equality requires shifts in institutions, including norms, changing how we think about men and women's roles, changing mindsets, and this is why we've come up with the collective action being this important response, as well as the innovation and the financing. So that's a bit of how we got to these particular objectives. So FCV has emerged as one of the frontier topics compared to 5 or even 10 years ago. And it's increasingly important to address for the World Bank to be able to fulfill its ambition to end extreme poverty and boost shared prosperity. So these goals become more interlaced. And we know that increasing gender equality is critical in FCV settings because the challenges are high. There are high barriers to women and girls' sexual and reproductive health and rights. Gender-based barriers limit women's and girls' economic empowerment. And I've already talked about all the forms of gender-based violence and the spillover effect that they have. So it's a high priority to implement projects and programs that respond to these challenges and to develop them in a way that includes the voices of the displaced and of women and girls, as we've heard here. But what I think is equally important to understand is that there's this large body of research and accumulating evidence which shows the link between gender equality and women's empowerment and as part of a solution to fragility, conflict and violence. So women's participation and leadership in communities tends to promote social environmental sustainability in community decisions and investments, which may in turn prevent and reduce fragility. So this link between getting into a virtuous circle of more gender equality, changing social norms against violence and against violence against women, can in turn be part of a conflict prevention strategy and part of the conflict response. And in societies where women have a stronger say in the economic, social and power sharing arrangements at the local level, there is now academic research which shows that in many cases countries are less prone to violence and conflict. So, as I said, the new gender strategy is under development. We've been consulting with NGOs, we've been consulting with CSOs. We will have a formal first draft out for consultation sometime in July, and we will be continuing to consult over the next few months, over the summer. So I hope you can all engage, go to the website. Normally, I would say I will drop the link in the chat, but as we haven't got a chat, I can't do that. Maybe I can give it to you later. But if you Google World Bank and World Bank Gender Strategy, you will come up with the link to our webpage. And there you can see the plans for the future. You can see some of our background work. And we would very much welcome your ideas, reaction, resources to help us really build this strategy to the level of ambition and momentum that we need to have in this space. So,
thank you. Thank you,
I think it was great gratitude to you both and for the opportunity to give to us to showcase our grantees and the work we do, empowering women, making the world a better place. I invite you for a lunch outside. And remember, you will get a mail from Meg and know why it is for the CCC in November, December. Thank you. We'd like to have more grantees. Thank you so much. Bye.